Go ahead and smile for Grandma. This might be the last birthday she spends on this land, my granddaughter whispered, not knowing I was standing just behind the kitchen door when she said it. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there, one hand resting against the cool wood of the doorframe, and listened as the laughter followed, soft, careless, like they were talking about rearranging furniture instead of dismantling a life that had taken me over 50 years to build. It was my 80th birthday, and outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the fields I had once walked with my husband, Daniel, back when our steps were quick and our dreams were still ahead of us. The farmhouse buzzed with voices, clinking glasses, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh cornbread, everything arranged just the way my family liked it, the way I had always made sure it was. I took a slow breath, straightened my blouse, and stepped back into the dining room with a smile so steady no one questioned it. There she is, Ethan said, raising his glass, his grin wide and easy, the same grin he used to wear as a boy when he'd run through these fields with mud on his boots. Happy 80th, Grandma. The others echoed him, their voices overlapping, warm on the surface, practiced underneath. Ashley stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her eyes flicking toward me with a softness that never quite reached her expression. We wanted everything to be perfect for you, she said, and I nodded as if I believed her. I sat at the head of the table, where I had sat for decades, looking out at faces I had fed, comforted, and protected, and I wondered, not for the first time, when exactly I had become something they spoke about in lowered voices instead of someone they spoke to. The cake was brought out, 3 layers, vanilla with buttercream frosting, just the way Daniel used to insist every birthday should be celebrated, no matter the number. Candles flickered, casting small, dancing shadows across the room. Make a wish, Grandma, someone said, and I leaned forward, the heat of the flames brushing my face as I closed my eyes. For a brief second, I saw Daniel. Standing in the doorway the way he used to, arms crossed, smiling like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Then I opened my eyes and blew the candles out in one steady breath. Applause filled the room, but it sounded distant, like it was happening somewhere else. Speech, Ethan joked, tapping his fork against his glass, and I gave a small laugh, shaking my head. At my age, I've learned it's better to listen than to talk, I said, my voice calm, even, exactly the way I wanted it to sound. They laughed again, not realizing how true that was. Dinner carried on with easy conversation, stories, and polite questions about how I was holding up out here alone, as if this house and this land hadn't been mine long before any of them thought to care about it. I answered gently, offering just enough to keep the rhythm of the evening intact, watching as Ashley leaned closer to Ethan, whispering something that made him nod slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window that overlooked the south field, the most valuable part of the property, if you knew anything about land development. I noticed everything. The way they exchanged looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The way certain topics fell quiet the moment I entered the room. The way Ashley's phone lit up with a message she turned away to read, her lips pressing into a thin line before she quickly smiled again. After dessert, people began to move around, some stepping outside to enjoy the cool evening air, others lingering in the living room. I excused myself quietly and walked down the hallway to my study, the one room that had remained unchanged over the years. The desk sat exactly where Daniel had left it, the surface worn smooth from decades of use. I closed the door behind me, the noise of the party fading into a dull murmur, and for a moment, I allowed myself to stand still. 80 years. 52 of them on this land. Every fence post, every acre, every quiet morning and long, exhausting harvest, it was all here, woven into the bones of this place. And out there, in the next room, they were already dividing it up in their minds. I walked over to the desk and rested my hand on a neatly stacked set of papers, my fingers tracing the edge of the top page. The faint sound of laughter drifted down the hallway again, followed by Ashley's voice, lower this time, more careful. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I already knew. I had known for longer than they could possibly imagine. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not sad, just steady, and then I smiled to myself, a small, quiet smile that no one else would see. Because while they were out there celebrating what they thought was the beginning of something, I had already made sure it would be the end of something else entirely. The house grew quieter as the evening stretched on, but not in the way it used to after family gatherings, not in that warm, satisfied silence that follows a good meal and shared stories. This was different, thinner somehow, like something essential had been taken out of it without anyone noticing except me, and I stood in the hallway for a moment before returning to the living room, smoothing my hands over my skirt as if I were simply an old woman trying to keep herself composed, when in truth, I was watching everything with a clarity I had not felt in years. Ethan was near the fireplace now, speaking in a lower voice to a man I did not recognize, tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who did not come out this far unless there was something to gain, and Ashley stood just behind them, her posture relaxed but her attention sharp, her eyes moving between the two men as if she were quietly directing the conversation without saying a word. I took a few slow steps into the room, letting the floorboards creak just enough to announce my presence, and all three of them turned at once, the conversation stopping mid-sentence. "Grandma, you should be resting," Ethan said quickly, his tone light, almost rehearsed. "It has been a long day for you." I smiled at him, the same smile I had given him since he was small, the one that used to mean comfort but now seemed to make him slightly uneasy. "I have had longer days than this," I replied, my voice gentle, and I let my gaze drift to the man beside him. "And you are?" The man stepped forward with a polite nod, extending his hand just enough to be courteous but not enough to invite anything more. "Daniel Reeves," he said. "I am a friend of Ashley's family." I noticed the way Ashley's fingers tightened slightly around her glass at that introduction, just for a second, just enough to tell me it was not the full truth. "It is a beautiful property you have here," he added, his eyes moving briefly toward the window as if he could already see beyond the walls, measuring distance, calculating value. I nodded once, slowly. "It has been in my family a long time," I said, and I watched the words settle over them, the way people do when they hear something that sounds like history but feels like an obstacle. "We were just talking about how peaceful it must be out here," Ashley said quickly, stepping forward to fill the space, her voice smooth again, controlled, away from everything. I let out a soft breath, as if considering her words. "Peaceful, yes," I said, "but not quiet, not if you know how to listen." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and then Ethan laughed, just a little too loudly. "Grandma always says things like that," he said, glancing at Daniel Reeves as if to smooth over the moment. The man smiled politely, but I could see it now, the slight impatience behind his expression, the kind that comes when a deal feels close but not yet secured, and I turned away first, ending the conversation before they could, giving them back their illusion of control. I moved into the kitchen, where the remains of the evening still lingered, plates stacked neatly, the smell of sugar and coffee in the air, and I began to clear a space on the counter, not because it needed to be done, but because it gave my hands something to do while my mind settled into place. From the living room, their voices resumed, softer now, more careful, but not careful enough. I could still hear fragments when the house shifted just right, numbers mentioned in passing, timelines spoken as if they were already agreed upon, and once, Ashley's voice, sharper than before. "We cannot wait too long," she said, followed by a pause, then lower. "She will not be able to manage this place much longer." Anyway, I did not stop what I was doing. I did not react. I simply continued stacking plates, rinsing them one by one, the water running steadily as if it could wash away the sound of her voice. But it did not. Nothing did, because this was not new, not really. It was only the first time they had let it slip so openly, the first time they had spoken as if I were already fading, already gone in all the ways that mattered to them. I dried my hands carefully and turned off the light in the kitchen, leaving the room in a soft shadow before walking back down the hallway, past the living room where they still stood in quiet conversation, and into my study once more. I closed the door behind me and sat down at the desk, the chair creaking slightly under my weight, familiar, grounding. I opened the top drawer and looked at the documents inside, each page exactly where I had left it, each signature already placed, each decision already made long before tonight. I rested my hand over them for a moment, not with hesitation, but with certainty, because everything I had heard that evening, every whispered plan and calculated glance, had only confirmed what I had suspected for months, that they were not waiting for permission, they were waiting for opportunity, and I had already taken that away from them. I leaned back in the chair and let the quiet settle around me, real quiet this time, the kind that does not hide anything, and I allowed myself a small, steady breath, not of relief, not yet, but of readiness, because if they believed this was the beginning of their plan, then they had not been paying attention, and I had spent 80 years learning how to pay attention to everything that mattered. The night settled slowly over the farm, stretching long shadows across the fields until the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the tree line, and one by one the cars began to leave, tires crunching softly against the gravel driveway as my family said their goodbyes in warm voices that lingered just a little too long, as if they were trying to leave behind an impression rather than a memory. I stood on the porch with my hands folded neatly in front of me, watching each of them go. Ashley hugged me lightly, careful, controlled. "We will come by more often, make sure you are not alone out here," she said, her tone sweet, her eyes already elsewhere. I nodded as if that was something I wanted, as if loneliness had ever been the problem. Ethan followed, giving me a quick embrace. "You should really think about getting some help around here, maybe even consider moving somewhere easier," he added, his voice softer now, almost concerned, but not quite. I smiled again. The same steady expression that seemed to confuse him more each time. "I will think about it," I said, and that was enough for him. It always was, because they did not need my agreement, only the illusion of it. The last car disappeared down the road, and the silence that followed was complete, not hollow like before, but full, grounded, the kind of silence that belongs to land that has outlasted generations of voices and plans and promises. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the cool night air against my skin, then turned and went back inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet, deliberate motion. The house was still, every room exactly as I had left it, but it felt different now, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been confirmed. I walked through the living room, past the empty glasses and neatly stacked plates, and into the kitchen where the faint smell of coffee still lingered. I did not rush, I did not clean, I simply moved through the space. As if retracing something, as if reminding myself of what was mine, what had always been mine, and what would remain so. I reached the back door and stepped outside again, this time alone, the porch light casting a soft glow over the yard. Beyond it the field stretched wide and dark, familiar even in the absence of light. I could walk them with my eyes closed, had done so more times than I could count, and for a moment I let myself remember, not with sadness, but with clarity, the early mornings when Daniel and I would wake before sunrise, the air sharp and cold, the ground still damp with dew. We built everything here piece by piece, not quickly, not easily, but steadily, and every inch of it carried that history, not just in the soil, but in me. I rested my hand on the porch railing and looked out across the south field, the one they kept glancing at, the one they thought would solve everything for them. I could almost hear their voices again, numbers, timelines, possibilities, as if the land were already something separate from me, something they could divide and distribute without consequence. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not tired, just measured, because the truth was simple. They were not wrong about one thing. I was 80, I had lived a long life, longer than many, and I knew how people saw that, how they translated age into absence, into opportunity, into something that could be quietly set aside. What they did not understand was that time does not always weaken a person. Sometimes it sharpens them, sometimes it strips away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains. And I had reached that point a long time ago. I turned back inside and walked down the hallway to my study, the familiar creak of the floorboards marking each step. I sat at the desk and opened the drawer again, taking out a single document this time, unfolding it carefully, the paper smooth beneath my fingers, the ink clear and deliberate. I read over the lines once more, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, because there was a certain satisfaction in seeing everything exactly as it should be, every detail accounted for, every outcome secured. Months ago, before the whispers had become plans, before the smiles had become performances, I had sat in this very chair with Lucas Whitmore across from me, his briefcase open, his expression serious but respectful. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he had asked, and I had met his gaze without hesitation. "I am sure," I had said, because I had already seen enough, already understood where things were heading. Even then, I had not been reacting, I had been preparing. I folded the document again and placed it back in the drawer, closing it with a soft click that seemed louder in the quiet room. I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but out of certainty, because while they were making plans for my future, I had already secured it, and not in the way they expected, not in a way they could undo with signatures or meetings or polite conversations. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, sitting there for a moment longer as the house settled around me, steady, unchanged, waiting, just like I was. Because whatever they thought was coming next, they had no idea that the real decision had already been made, and it was not theirs to make. Morning came slowly, the kind of quiet morning that does not announce itself with noise but with light, soft and steady through the kitchen window, stretching across the table where I had sat countless times before, and I woke not with urgency, not with confusion, but with a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if the day had already been decided before I even opened my eyes. I moved through the house at my usual pace, making coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, pouring slowly, listening to the familiar sounds that had not changed in decades, and for a moment it could have been any other morning, any other year, except it was not, because now every detail carried a different weight, every silence held meaning. I carried my cup out to the porch and sat in the chair Daniel had built himself all those years ago, the wood worn smooth from time, the armrest shaped by hands that were no longer here, and I looked out across the fields as the sun lifted higher, revealing everything clearly, nothing hidden, not the fences, not the rows of soil, not the long stretch of land that had been the center of my life for more than half a century. I did not feel fear, I did not feel anger, I felt something steadier than that, something that had taken years to form, because this was not the first time I had seen people underestimate what they thought was already behind them, and I had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do is assume someone has nothing left to protect. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth settle before standing and going back inside. There were things to do, not because I needed to rush, but because timing mattered. It always had. I walked into my study and opened the drawer again, taking out the same document I had looked at the night before, along with another, slightly older, the edges worn from handling. I placed them side by side on the desk, reading through each line carefully, not searching for mistakes, but confirming what I already knew. Everything was in place, every signature, every clause, every decision that had been made quietly, deliberately. Without anyone noticing, I folded them again and placed them into a simple envelope, sealing it with a firm press of my hand. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not needed to use in some time. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Lucas Whitmore speaking, his tone as steady as ever. I allowed myself the smallest pause before replying. "It is Margaret," I said, and there was a brief silence on the other end. Not of surprise, but of recognition. "Good morning, Margaret," he said. "I was wondering when I might hear from you." I looked out the window as I spoke, my voice even, controlled. "I believe it is time," I said, nothing more, nothing less, and he understood. Of course he did. That was why I had chosen him all those years ago, not just for his knowledge, but for his ability to listen between the words. "I will make the necessary arrangements," he replied, and that was all that needed to be said. I thanked him and hung up, placing the phone back exactly where it had been. The house was still quiet, but it felt different now, not waiting, not uncertain, but moving, even if no one else could see it yet. I walked through each room slowly, not to say goodbye, but to remember with clarity, the photographs on the wall, the small imperfections in the woodwork, the way the light shifted depending on the time of day. These were not things that could be measured or sold or divided, no matter how hard someone tried, and that was something they would never fully understand. I stepped outside again, this time walking down toward the barn, my steps steady against the packed dirt path, the air cool but bright, and as I reached the edge of the south field, I stopped, looking out over the land they believed they could claim. I could already imagine the conversations they would have in the coming days, the meetings, the assumptions, the quiet confidence that everything was falling into place exactly as they had planned. I almost admired it, that certainty, because it made what came next so much clearer. I turned back toward the house, the envelope still in my hand, and began to walk slowly, deliberately, not with hesitation, but with purpose, because this was not about reacting anymore. It had not been for a long time. This was about timing, about letting things unfold just enough for the truth to land where it needed to. And as I reached the porch steps and placed my hand on the railing, I allowed myself one final thought, not of what they were doing, but of what they had missed, because while they had been busy planning what to take from me, they had never once stopped to ask what I had already given away, and that was the part that would change everything. The next 2 days passed with a kind of quiet precision that only comes when everything has already been decided. I followed my routine as I always had, waking early, tending to the small tasks that kept the house and land in order, feeding the chickens, checking the fence line along the north pasture, running my hand along the wooden posts the way Daniel used to, not because they needed it, but because it reminded me of the years when every part of this place required our full attention, and Through it all I felt it, that subtle shift beneath the surface, the sense that something was moving just out of sight, not here on the land, but elsewhere, in conversations I was not meant to hear, in plans that were being finalized without me. Late that afternoon the phone rang, and I already knew who it would be before I picked it up. Grandma. Ethan's voice came through, warm, casual, just slightly too eager. We were thinking of coming by tomorrow, just to check on you, make sure everything is all right after the party. I smiled to myself, though he could not see it. That would be nice, I replied, my tone even, welcoming. I will be here. There was a brief pause, as if he had expected more, something softer perhaps, something grateful, but I gave him nothing beyond what was necessary. Great, he said quickly, Ashley will come too. We might bring someone along, just to take a look at a few things around the property. Nothing serious, just ideas. I repeated silently, the words settling into place exactly where it belonged. Of course, I said, and we ended the call shortly after. I placed the phone back down and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet return. Then I walked to the study and opened the drawer once more, not because I needed reassurance, but because I respected the process. I took out the envelope and held it in my hands, the paper firm, unyielding, just like the decision inside it. I did not open it. I did not need to. Instead I placed it neatly on the desk, where it would remain until the moment it was needed. The following morning arrived clear and cool, the kind of day that makes everything look sharper, more defined. And I prepared the house as I always did when expecting company, not out of obligation, but out of habit. Coffee brewed, a simple pie set on the counter, the windows open just enough to let the fresh air move through, and when I heard the sound of tires on gravel just after noon, I wiped my hands on a towel and walked calmly to the front door. Ethan stepped out first, followed by Ashley, and behind them, Daniel Reeves once again, his posture confident, his gaze already scanning the property. Before he had even reached the porch, Grandma, Ethan said with a smile, stepping forward, we did not want you to feel alone out here. I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. You are very thoughtful, I said, and Ashley's lips curved slightly, pleased, or perhaps relieved. Inside, they moved through the house with polite curiosity, commenting on the structure, the layout, the potential, as Daniel Reeves called it, his words careful, measured, as if he were already presenting an argument. He expected to win. I listened, offering small responses when necessary, never too much, never too little, just enough to keep everything moving exactly where it needed to go. There is a lot that could be done here, Ashley said at one point, standing near the window that overlooked the south field, her reflection faint in the glass. With the right planning, this place could be transformed into something incredible. I followed her gaze, letting my eyes rest on the land that had never needed transformation to hold its value. It already is, I said quietly, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan cleared his throat, stepping forward. We have actually been thinking, he began, his tone shifting slightly, more serious now, about ways to make things easier for you, you know, long term, I repeated silently, turning back to face him, my expression calm, open. That sounds important, I said, giving him the space he believed he needed. Ashley stepped in then, her voice smooth, practiced. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, that you are taken care of, that the property is managed in the best possible way. Managed, taken care of, the words came one after another, each one designed to sound like concern, each one carrying something else beneath it. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, until they had finished saying exactly what they came to say, and then I nodded once, slowly, as if considering it all for the first time. I see, I said, my voice steady, and I let a small pause settle between us, just long enough to make them wonder, just long enough to shift the balance without them realizing it, because while they believed they were guiding the conversation, I had already decided where it would end, and they were about to walk there on their own. They waited for me to say more. I could see it in the way Ethan shifted his weight slightly, in the way Ashley held her breath just long enough to signal expectation, and Daniel Reeves stood quietly, observing, measuring, as if this moment was simply another step in a process he had completed many times before. But I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch, not awkward, not tense, just present, because people reveal more when they think they need to guide the conversation forward. We have actually spoken with someone about options, Ethan continued, his voice more deliberate now, just to understand what could be done with the land, if you ever decided it was too much to handle. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing the information for the first time, even though I had heard enough already to know exactly how far those options had been discussed. That sounds like a lot of planning, I said, my tone thoughtful, and Ashley stepped closer, her smile returning, confident again. We just want to be prepared, she said. You deserve to enjoy your time without worrying about all of this. Her hand gestured lightly toward the window, toward the land that had never once felt like a burden to me, only to those who saw it as something to acquire. I folded my hands in front of me and gave a small nod. Preparation is important, I said, and I saw it then, the flicker of relief in Ethan's eyes, the subtle shift in Ashley's posture, as if they believed the hardest part was over, as if my agreement, or what they thought was agreement, had already been secured. Daniel Reeves cleared his throat gently, stepping forward with the practiced ease of someone used to closing conversations. If you would ever like, I could walk you through what a transition might look like, he said, his voice smooth, professional, just so you have a clear understanding of the process. I turned to look at him fully this time, holding his gaze just long enough to make sure he understood I was not someone to be guided without awareness. I appreciate that, I replied, but I have always believed in understanding things before they are presented to me. There was a pause, subtle but noticeable, and for a brief second, something in his expression shifted, not uncertainty, but recognition, the kind that comes when a situation is not unfolding exactly as expected. I let that moment pass and moved toward the kitchen, gesturing lightly for them to follow. You must be tired from the drive, I said. There is fresh coffee. They followed, of course they did, because the conversation was still moving forward, just not in the direction they believed. Cups were filled, polite remarks exchanged, and for a few minutes, everything returned to the surface level ease they had constructed, but underneath it, I could feel it building, their patience thinning, their need to secure something more concrete pressing against the edges of their politeness. It was Ashley who spoke again, setting her cup down carefully. We were also thinking, she began, her tone softer now, almost careful, that it might be a good idea to start putting some things in writing, just to make sure there is no confusion later. There it was, finally, not hidden, not wrapped in suggestion, but placed directly on the table. I looked at her, then at Ethan, then briefly at Daniel Reeves, and I let a small silence settle again, not long, just enough. You are right, I said, my voice calm, certain. Clarity is important. I saw the immediate reaction, the quiet satisfaction, the belief that this was the moment they had been working toward. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Exactly, he said. We just want everything to be clear, for everyone, I repeated. Silently, and I gave a small nod. Then perhaps it is time we put everything on the table, I said, and I turned without waiting for a response. Walking down the hallway toward my study, I could hear them behind me, their footsteps measured, their voices low, anticipation threading through each movement. I reached the desk and opened the drawer, taking out the envelope I had prepared, holding it for a moment before turning back to face them. They stood just inside the doorway now, Ashley slightly ahead, Ethan close behind her, Daniel Reeves observing from just over their shoulders, and I stepped forward, placing the envelope gently on the desk between us. I agree, I said, my voice steady, composed. It is time everything is made clear, and for the first time since they arrived, I allowed myself to meet each of their eyes without softening the moment, because what they were about to understand was not something that could be explained away, not something that could be adjusted or negotiated. It was something that had already been decided, long before they ever thought to include me in their plans. For a moment, no one moved, the envelope resting on the desk between us like something far heavier than paper, and I watched them carefully, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with a quiet attention that came from years of understanding how people react when they believe they are about to gain something. Ashley was the first to step forward. Of course she was, her hand reaching toward the envelope with a kind of controlled confidence, as if she already knew what it contained, as if this was simply the final confirmation of everything she had been building toward. We can go through it together, she said, her voice calm, almost reassuring, but I did not release the moment so easily. I placed my hand lightly over the envelope before she could pick it up, not stopping her, just pausing the action, just enough to shift the rhythm, and she looked at me then, really looked, for the first time since she walked into the house, and I saw it, that brief flicker of uncertainty, small, but unmistakable. Before we do that, I said, my voice steady, I would like to ask you something. The room held still again. Ethan straightened slightly, Daniel Reeves remained where he was, his expression attentive now, no longer simply observing but evaluating. Ashley withdrew her hand just enough to give space, though I could tell she did not like the interruption. Of course, she said. What is it? I let my gaze move between them, not accusing, not searching, simply present. When did you decide, I asked, that this was no longer my home? The question settled into the room without force, without accusation, but it did not need either, because it was not a question they had prepared for, not one they had practiced answering in careful, polite terms. Ethan blinked, his expression shifting. That is not what we think, he said quickly, but the words came too fast, too automatic. Ashley stepped in again, her voice smoother, more controlled. We are only trying to help, she said. This is about making things easier for you. Easier, I repeated silently, and I nodded once. Slowly, I understand what you are saying, I replied, but that was not my question. The silence that followed was different now, not expectant, not guided, but exposed, and for a brief second, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were deciding how much of the truth they were willing to let surface. Daniel Reeves cleared his throat lightly, as if to redirect. Perhaps we should focus on the documents, he suggested, but I did not move. I did not shift my attention, because this moment mattered more than anything written on paper. It matters, I said quietly, because this place was never just land to me. My voice did not rise, it did not waver, it simply held steady, and I would like to know when it became something else to you. Ashley's expression tightened, just slightly, the composure still there, but thinner now. We are being practical, she said, that is all. Practical, another word that sounded reasonable until you looked at what it replaced. I let a small pause settle again, then I nodded, as if accepting her answer, even though we both knew it was not one. I see, I said, and this time, I lifted my hand from the envelope, stepping back just enough to give them exactly what they thought they wanted. Ashley did not hesitate now. She picked up the envelope and opened it carefully, her movements precise, controlled, as if she were already preparing to explain whatever was inside. Ethan leaned closer, his attention fixed. Daniel Reeves stepped forward slightly, his posture sharpening, and I watched them as they unfolded the document, as their eyes moved across the page, as the first line settled in, and then the next, and then something changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Ashley's expression did not collapse, it did not break, but it shifted, the certainty fading into something quieter, something more cautious. Ethan frowned slightly, his eyes moving back to the beginning as if he needed to confirm what he was reading. Daniel Reeves leaned in further now, his gaze scanning quickly, professionally, and for the first time since he arrived. He did not speak immediately. I said nothing. I did not explain, I did not guide them through it. I simply stood there, allowing the words on the page to do what they were designed to do, because this was never about catching them off guard, it was about letting them see, clearly, completely, what had already been put into motion long before they believed they had any control over it. And as the silence settled once more, deeper this time, heavier, I allowed myself a small breath, steady and calm, because the moment they had been working toward had finally arrived, just not in the way they had imagined. The silence did not break all at once, it stretched, slow and heavy, as Ashley's eyes moved across the page again, this time more carefully, as if the meaning might change if she read it differently. Ethan leaned closer, his brow tightening, his confidence slipping into something more uncertain, and Daniel Reeves, who had remained composed until now, straightened slightly, his expression sharpening with a kind of professional awareness that told me he understood exactly what he was looking at. Even if the others did not fully grasp it yet. This, Ashley began, her voice quieter now, controlled but no longer smooth. This cannot be right. She flipped the page, scanning quickly, searching for something she expected to find but did not, and I watched her, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with the same calm attention I had carried all along, because this moment was not about proving them wrong, it was about letting them understand what had already been done. Ethan looked up at me then, confusion clear in his expression. Grandma, what is this? He asked, his voice no longer steady, and I met his gaze without hesitation. It is exactly what you asked for, I said. Clarity. Daniel Reeves stepped forward now, taking the document gently from Ashley's hands, his movements precise, his eyes scanning each line with the kind of focus that comes from years of reading what others overlook. And when he spoke, his tone had changed, no longer guiding, no longer suggesting, but acknowledging. This is a trust, he said, looking at me briefly before returning his attention to the page, an irrevocable trust. The words settled into the room with weight, even if Ethan and Ashley did not fully understand it yet. Ashley's lips pressed together, her posture tightening. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice still controlled, but thinner now. Daniel Reeves did not rush his answer. He read a few more lines, confirming what he already knew, then looked up. "It means the property has already been transferred," he said. "Ownership is no longer in your grandmother's personal name." Ethan blinked, trying to process. "Transferred to who?" he asked, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that sounded less like certainty and more like realization. Daniel Reeves turned the page slightly, pointing to a section, "To the Whitmore Agricultural Preservation Trust," he said, "managed by an independent board, with specific conditions that prevent sale or development." The words hung there, clear, undeniable, and I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my posture unchanged. Ashley shook her head slightly, as if rejecting the explanation before fully accepting it. "That does not make sense," she said. "You cannot just give it away like that." I tilted my head slightly, considering her words. "It was never about giving it away," I said calmly. "It was about protecting it." Ethan took a step back, his eyes moving between me and the document. "But what about us?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it, and I noticed that, not the words themselves, but the shift, the moment where concern for me had quietly been replaced with concern for what they believed they were entitled to. I did not react to it. I did not need to. "You are still my family," I said, my voice even. "That has not changed." Ashley let out a small breath, her composure returning in pieces. "Then why would you do this without telling us?" she asked, and I met her gaze, steady, unhurried. "Because you were already making plans without telling me," I replied, not sharply, not accusing, simply stating what was true, and that was enough. The room fell quiet again, but this time there was no expectation in it, no sense of control, only the slow settling of a reality they had not prepared for. Daniel Reeves closed the document carefully, his expression thoughtful now. "This was done properly," he said, almost to himself. "There is very little that can be challenged here." Ashley's jaw tightened slightly at that, but she said nothing. Ethan looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at me, searching for something, perhaps a way to reverse what had already been decided, perhaps a sign that this was not final, but I gave him neither, because there was nothing left to negotiate. Nothing left to adjust. Everything that mattered had already been set in place. I stepped forward then, just enough to close the distance between us, not to confront, not to press, but to bring the moment to where it needed to be. "You said you wanted everything to be clear," I said, my voice calm, steady. "Now it is." And I let the words rest there, without explanation, without elaboration, because clarity does not require more than that. It simply requires the truth to stand where everyone can see it, and in that moment, there was nothing left for them to misunderstand. No one spoke for several seconds after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said without needing to be repeated. Ashley stood very still, her posture composed but no longer confident, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Ethan looked between us again, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something quieter, something closer to understanding, and Daniel Reeves, who had entered this house as if he were guiding a transaction, now stood as a witness to something he had not anticipated, his silence more respectful than before. I did not rush to fill the space. I did not explain further, because there was nothing left to clarify. The document had done its work, the truth had settled exactly where it needed to, and all that remained was for them to accept it in their own time. I stepped back slightly, giving them room, not out of retreat, but out of completion, because this moment was not about holding them in it. It was about letting them carry it with them. Ashley was the first to move again, slowly placing her hand flat against the desk as she leaned forward just enough to speak. "So that is it," she said, her voice controlled but thinner now. "There is nothing we can do." I met her gaze calmly, not with resistance, not with apology. "There is nothing that needs to be done," I replied, and that distinction settled between us just as firmly as everything else had. Ethan let out a quiet breath, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had seen many times before when he was younger, when things did not go the way he expected, but this was different now. There was no quick solution, no adjustment to make, no way to reframe what had already been decided. "You planned this," he said finally, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating what he now understood. I nodded once. "I prepared," I said, and that was all, because preparation had always been part of survival, part of building something that lasted, and part of protecting it when others no longer saw it the same way. Daniel Reeves cleared his throat softly, stepping back as if to re-establish his place outside of the family dynamic he had briefly been pulled into. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, his tone professional again, but quieter, more measured. "There is very little room for interpretation here." Ashley did not respond to him, her attention still fixed on me, searching perhaps for something she could still influence, something she could still change, but there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to negotiate. I walked past them then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just as I always had, moving through my own home with the same steady pace, and I returned to the living room where the afternoon light had shifted, casting long lines across the floor. I paused near the window, looking out over the land once more, the same fields, the same fences, the same quiet strength that had carried through every season, and I felt it again, not relief, not victory, but alignment, the sense that everything was exactly where it needed to be, behind me. I could hear them gathering their things, their movements quieter now, more contained, the easy confidence from earlier replaced with something more careful, more aware. Ethan stepped into the doorway after a moment, hesitating slightly before speaking. "We did not mean to," he began. But the sentence did not finish, because there was no simple way to complete it, no version of it that would change what had already been revealed. I turned to him, my expression calm, not distant, not cold, just clear. "You meant what you planned," I said gently, "and I understood what I needed to do." He nodded slowly, absorbing that, not resisting it, just accepting it in the way people do when they realize they have reached the end of something they thought was still beginning. Ashley appeared behind him, her posture composed again, but different now, less certain, more contained. She did not speak, and she did not need to, because whatever she had intended to accomplish here had already been answered. Daniel Reeves followed, offering a small, respectful nod in my direction before stepping outside, and one by one, they left the house, their footsteps fading across the porch, the sound of the car doors closing, the engine starting, the gravel shifting beneath the tires as they drove away. And then there was silence again, not empty, not uncertain, but complete. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to it, feeling it settle fully into the space around me, and then I turned back toward the window, resting my hand lightly against the glass, looking out over the land that had never once stopped being mine, not because of a document, not because of ownership, but because I had chosen to protect it in the only way that truly mattered, and as the last trace of their presence disappeared down the road, I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, steady and certain, because what they had come for was no longer something they could reach, and what remained was exactly what it had always been, untouched, unbroken, and finally understood.